Welcome to Switzerland. It is a country of alpine peaks and crystal lakes, of quiet villages and cities that hum with culture and history. And it is a country that has drawn the famous, the brilliant, and the restless from every corner of the world, not just to live, but to stay forever. Tonight, we are visiting 40 remarkable people who are buried or memorialized in Switzerland, from the shores of Lake Geneva to the hills above Zurich, from the Italian warmth of Ticino to the mountain churchyards of the Valais. Their stories span centuries, continents, and every kind of human achievement. So settle in and let us begin where all great tours of Swiss celebrity graves must begin, on the gentle hillside above the village of Coursier-sur-Vevey. The cemetery here overlooks Lake Geneva, and it contains the remains of a man whose face was once the most recognizable on earth. The bowler hat, the bamboo cane, the toothbrush mustache, the funny waddle. This is the resting place of Charlie Chaplin. Born in London in 1889 into desperate poverty, his mother was committed to an asylum, his father drank himself to death, young Charlie was performing in music halls by his teens. He and his older brother Sidney grew up in workhouses and with foster families, scraping by in the slums of South London. It was a Dickensian childhood in the truest sense, and it gave Chaplin an instinctive understanding of the underdog that would fuel his art for the rest of his life. By his mid-20s, he was in America making short comedies for Mack Sennett's Keystone Studios. It was there in 1914 that he assembled the costume of the little tramp for the first time. The too-tight coat, the baggy trousers, the derby hat, the cane, the shuffling duck-footed walk. He claimed he put on the costume and the character simply appeared to him. That character made Chaplin the most famous human being alive, not just in America, but worldwide, in countries where people had never heard of the President of the United States, but knew the little tramp. Within a few years, he was not only starring in his own films, but writing, directing, producing, and composing the music for them. He co-founded United Artists in 1919 alongside Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith, four of the biggest names in the movie business banding together to control their own work. When someone pointed out that the inmates were running the asylum, that was meant as a compliment. His features are landmarks of cinema. The Kid in 1921, where he teamed with the child actor Jackie Coogan and produced moments of comedy and heartbreak that still work perfectly today. The Gold Rush in 1925, with its famous sequence of the little tramp eating a shoe. City Lights. In 1931, whose final scene, where the blind flower girl, her sight now restored, recognizes the tramp who paid for her operation, is one of the most emotionally devastating moments in all of cinema. Modern Times in 1936. All of them were silent films made years after the rest of Hollywood had gone to sound, because Chaplin understood that the tramp's power lay beyond words. When he finally did make a talking picture, it was 1940's The Great Dictator, a searing satire of Adolf Hitler that remains one of the bravest films ever produced. Chaplin played both a Jewish barber and a dictator modeled on Hitler, a dangerous high-wire act that only Chaplin could have pulled off. Its final speech, in which the barber addresses the world and pleads for kindness and humanity, has been watched hundreds of millions of times. Chaplin received multiple Academy Award nominations over his career, but the only competitive Oscar he ever took home was for the musical score of Limelight, a reminder that he was a talented composer as well as everything else. He wrote the melody that became the pop standard Smile, later recorded by Nat King Cole. In 1972, 3 years before his death, the Academy invited him back to Hollywood for an honorary award. The audience gave him a standing ovation lasting 12 minutes, among the longest in Oscar history. That homecoming meant the world to Chaplin because he had been effectively banished from the United States. During the Red Scare of the early 1950s, he was accused of communist sympathies, accusations that were never proven. And while traveling abroad in 1952, his re-entry permit was revoked by the U.S. Attorney General. He never returned. Instead, he settled here in Switzerland, in a manor house called Manoir de Bonne overlooking the lake, with his fourth wife, Una O'Neill, daughter of the great playwright Eugene O'Neill. Una had married Chaplin when she was just 18 and he was 54, a union that scandalized polite society but proved to be a deeply loving partnership that lasted the rest of his life. They raised 8 children together in this Swiss village. Chaplin continued to make films, A King in New York in 1957 and A Countess from Hong Kong in 1967. But his days of world-conquering cinema were behind him. He spent his final decade here in comfortable retirement, receiving visitors, composing music, and being adored by his enormous family. Chaplin died on Christmas Day 1977 after suffering a stroke in his sleep. He was 88 years old. 2 months after his burial, his coffin was stolen from this very cemetery by 2 men, a Pole and a Bulgarian, who demanded a ransom of 600,000 Swiss francs from the family. Una Chaplin refused to pay. The police traced the calls, the thieves were arrested, and the coffin was recovered from a cornfield not far from here. It was reburied and set in concrete to prevent anything like that from ever happening again. Una, who passed in 1991, lies beside him. Today, Chaplin's manor house has been turned into Chaplin's World, a museum devoted to his life and art. But it is here, in this cemetery, among the headstones and the wildflowers, that you feel closest to the man himself. Just across the cemetery from Chaplin, you will find the grave of another figure from the golden age of cinema, a man whose career spanned 5 decades, and whose screen presence radiated intelligence and quiet menace in equal measure. This is where James Mason rests. Mason was one of the finest British actors of the 20th century. American audiences remember him best as the icily elegant villain Philip Van Damme in Hitchcock's North by Northwest, sparring with Cary Grant aboard a train and across the face of Mount Rushmore. He was equally unforgettable as the tortured Humbert in Stanley Kubrick's Lolita and as the fading movie star Norman Maine in the 1954 version of A Star is Born, opposite Judy Garland. That performance earned him one of 3 Academy Award nominations. The others came for Georgie Girl and The Verdict, but he never won. Mason made well over 100 films in his career. Born in Yorkshire in 1909, he became a matinee idol in British cinema during the 1940s before moving to Hollywood, where he reinvented himself as a leading man of depth and complexity. In his later years, Mason settled along Lake Geneva and became friends with his neighbor Charlie Chaplin. When Mason died of a heart attack in Lausanne in July 1984, at the age of 75, his family chose to have his ashes interred here at Coursier-sur-Vevey, near Chaplin, 2 giants of British cinema resting side by side. A short drive southwest from Coursier takes us to the village of Corseaux, climbing the hillside above Vevey. The Cimetière des Monts de Coursier occupies a peaceful slope, and here lies one of the greatest English-language novelists of the 20th century, Graham Greene. If you have seen The Third Man, that shadowy thriller set in post-war Vienna, with Orson Welles emerging from the shadows of a doorway and delivering his famous speech about Switzerland, cuckoo clocks, and 500 years of peace, you have felt the chill of Greene's imagination. It is worth noting the irony. Greene, who put that dismissive line about Switzerland into the mouth of a character, ended up choosing this country as his final home. If you have read The Power and the Glory, about a whiskey priest on the run in anti-clerical Mexico, or The End of the Affair, a devastating novel of love and faith set in wartime London, or The Quiet American, which predicted the American disaster in Vietnam years before it happened, you know the moral complexity Greene brought to every page. He was a master of what he called the dangerous edge of things, the territory where loyalty and betrayal, faith and doubt, love and suspicion overlap. Greene published more than 25 novels over 6 decades and was repeatedly considered for the Nobel Prize in Literature, though the Swedish Academy never gave it to him. Many literary critics consider it one of the great oversights in the history of the prize. Greene divided his own fiction into what he called novels, the serious literary works, and entertainments, the thrillers. But the distinction was always somewhat arbitrary, because the entertainments, like Our Man in Havana and The Ministry of Fear, were often just as psychologically rich and morally probing as the literary novels. Greene lived all over the world: London, Liberia, Mexico, Vietnam, Haiti, the south of France. He was a British intelligence officer during the Second World War, working under Kim Philby, who turned out to be a Soviet double agent. Greene had a lifelong fascination with espionage, Catholicism, moral failure, and the places where those things intersected. He spent his final years here on the Swiss Riviera, in an apartment in Corso overlooking Lake Geneva, drawn by the quiet and the privacy and the proximity to a good bookshop. He died in April 1991 at the age of 86 from a blood disease. He is buried within a few miles of Chaplin and Mason, though in a different cemetery. The three of them were part of a small English-speaking colony along this stretch of the lake, and they knew each other socially. In death as in life, they remain neighbors. From Corso, we continue along the lake shore to the tiny village of Tolochenaz, between Lausanne and Morges. The cemetery here holds barely more than 100 graves, and nestled among them is the resting place of a woman who personified grace, beauty, and generosity of spirit. We are at the grave of Audrey Hepburn. She was born Audrey Kathleen Rustin in Brussels in 1929 to a Dutch mother and a British father. Her childhood was indelibly marked by the German occupation of the Netherlands. She experienced real hunger, fear, and loss, and those early experiences shaped everything that came after. During the war, Hepburn was a teenager in Arnhem. She witnessed Nazi atrocities firsthand, including the deportation of Jewish families from her neighborhood. Food was so scarce that she ate tulip bulbs and grass to survive. She danced in secret recitals to raise money for the Dutch resistance. These were not stories she told often, but they lived inside her and drove her humanitarian work decades later. After the war, she studied ballet and took small roles on the London stage before Hollywood discovered her. Director William Wyler was searching for an unknown to play Princess Anne in Roman Holiday, opposite Gregory Peck. Hepburn won the part in a screen test that became legendary. Wyler kept the cameras rolling after the formal test ended and captured her laughing and chatting naturally. And that unguarded charm is what sealed it. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Roman Holiday. She was 24. Peck, who was already a huge star and could have demanded top billing alone, insisted that Hepburn's name be placed alongside his above the title. He said afterward that he knew from their first scene together that she would win the Oscar. What followed was one of the most luminous film careers ever, Sabrina, directed by Billy Wilder. Funny Face with Fred Astaire. The Nun's Story, directed by Fred Zinnemann, which showcased her dramatic range. Breakfast at Tiffany's, where her portrayal of Holly Golightly with the little black dress and the long cigarette holder became a permanent icon of style and yearning. And My Fair Lady, in which she played Eliza Doolittle, though her singing was dubbed by Marni Nixon, a fact that disappointed her deeply. In all, she received 5 Oscar nominations. She also won a Tony Award, a Grammy Award, and an Emmy Award over the course of her career, making her one of the rare EGOT winners. But Hepburn walked away from full-time acting while still in her 30s, choosing to raise her sons in privacy. She moved to Tolochenaz in 1966 and lived here for the remaining 27 years of her life, tending her garden, walking her dogs, shopping at the market in nearby morgues, and cooking for friends. In 1988, she was appointed a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, and she threw herself into the role with a passion that surprised even those who knew her well. She traveled to Ethiopia, Sudan, El Salvador, Guatemala, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Somalia, visiting refugee camps and famine zones, holding sick children, and using her fame to draw the world's attention to their suffering. "I've been auditioning my whole life for this role," she said. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for this work. Hepburn died of appendiceal cancer in January 1993, at the age of 63, at her home in Tolochenaz. She is buried here among the villagers she called her neighbors for nearly 3 decades. Few graves anywhere in Switzerland receive more visitors, and the flowers on her grave are always fresh. Leaving Tolochenaz, we make our way into the city of Lausanne and the Bois de Vaux Cemetery. This is one of the most storied burial grounds in all of Switzerland, And our first stop here is at a name recognized the world over. This is where Coco Chanel lies. Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel was born in 1883 in Saumur, France, in a poorhouse hospital. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Gabrielle was 12. Her father abandoned the family almost immediately afterward. She and her sisters were placed in an orphanage run by the nuns of the Abbey of Aubazine, and it was there, in that austere setting, that she learned to sew, the skill that would reshape the entire world of fashion. The black and white palette of the nuns' habits, the clean lines of the abbey's architecture, even the interlocking arches of the stained glass windows that some scholars believe inspired the interlocking C logo. The orphanage left its mark on everything Chanel would later create. She took the nickname Coco from a song she used to sing in a cabaret during her brief career as a singer, though she later claimed it was a term of endearment from her father. By the 1920s, Chanel had revolutionized how women dressed. Where the fashion world had offered corsets and elaborate ornamentation, Chanel offered simplicity, comfort, and understated elegance. The little black dress, the Chanel suit with its collarless jacket and slim skirt, the quilted handbag with its gold chain strap. And in 1921, Chanel No. 5, the perfume that Coco herself helped formulate, telling the chemist she wanted a fragrance that smelled like a woman, not like a flower. It remains one of the best-selling perfumes in history over a century later. Marilyn Monroe, famously asked what she wore to bed, answered Chanel No. 5. But Chanel's story has a darker chapter that her company has long preferred to leave unmentioned. During the Second World War, she was romantically involved with Hans Gunther von Dinklage, a German officer who was also an intelligence operative. Chanel herself worked as an agent for German military intelligence, assigned the codename Westminster. The full extent of her collaboration remains debated by historians, but the basic facts are not in dispute. After the liberation of Paris, she fled to Switzerland to avoid prosecution. She settled in Lausanne, staying initially at the Beau Rivage Palace Hotel. She lived there for nearly a decade, keeping a relatively low profile, though her idea of keeping a low profile included having her chauffeur follow her in a Cadillac during her lakeside promenades. In 1954, at the age of 71, she mounted one of the great comebacks in fashion history, returning to Paris and relaunching her couture house. The French press mocked the first collection, but American buyers embraced it, and within a few years, Chanel was once again the dominant force in women's fashion. She continued to work almost until the day she died. On January 10, 1971, at the age of 87, Chanel died in her suite at the Ritz Paris, where she had lived for more than 30 years. But she had wanted to be buried in Lausanne, and so she was. She designed her own grave. 5 carved lions adorn the headstone. Leo was her zodiac sign and 5 was her lucky number. The stele stands in front of the tomb rather than on top. She reportedly explained that she did not want a stone on her head in case she decided to come back. While we are here at Bois de Vaux, a short walk brings us to another grave that belongs not to the world of fashion, but to the world of sport. Pierre de Coubertin is buried here, the man who revived the Olympic Games. Baron Pierre de Coubertin was a French educator obsessed with the idea of reviving the ancient Greek athletic tradition. He believed international competition could promote peace and mutual understanding among nations. In 1894, he organized the Congress that created the International Olympic Committee, and in 1896, the first modern Olympics were held in Athens. Coubertin served as president of the IOC for nearly 3 decades. He also designed the 5 interlocking rings that serve as the Olympic symbol. He moved to Lausanne in 1915, and the city became the permanent home of the IOC, a connection that endures today. Coubertin's later years were marked by financial difficulty. Despite his enormous contribution to world culture, he died in relative poverty. He suffered a heart attack while walking in a Geneva park in September 1937 at the age of 74. His body was buried here in Lausanne, but at his own request, his heart was removed and taken to Olympia, Greece, where it was placed in a monument near the ancient stadium. His body rests in Switzerland. His heart rests in the birthplace of the Games. Still at Bois de Vaux, we can visit the grave of a man whose life ended at terrifying speed, literally. Jochen Rindt, the Austrian racing driver, is buried here, and his story is unique in the annals of Formula One. Rindt was born in Mainz, Germany in 1942 and raised in Austria by his grandparents after both his parents were killed in an Allied bombing raid during the war. He was a fearless, supremely talented driver who dominated the 1970 Formula One season, winning 5 consecutive Grands Prix for Lotus. His style behind the wheel was thrilling and aggressive, and by September 1970, he had built what seemed like an insurmountable lead in the championship standings. Then, during practice for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, his car's brake shaft failed. The Lotus slammed into a barrier, and Rindt was killed instantly. He was 28 years old. No one overtook his points total that season, and he was declared world champion posthumously, the only time in Formula One history this has happened. His wife Nina had family connections to Switzerland, and Rindt was laid to rest here in Lausanne. Now we leave Lausanne and head northeast to the outskirts of Zurich, climbing the hill to the Fluntern Cemetery. This cemetery sits near the Zurich Zoo, and it is one of the most visited burial grounds in Switzerland. The reason is literature. Here lies James Joyce. It seems strange that Ireland's most famous writer is buried not in Dublin but in Zurich. But Joyce left Ireland in 1904, the year in which Ulysses is set, and essentially never went back except for a handful of brief visits. He lived in Trieste, where he taught English and started a family with Nora Barnacle, his lifelong companion and eventual wife. He lived in Paris, where he wrote most of his masterpieces. And he lived twice in Zurich, once during each World War, finding in this neutral city a haven from the conflicts that tore the rest of Europe apart. It was here during the First World War that he wrote much of Ulysses, the novel that redefined what fiction could do and be. Published in 1922 by the Paris bookshop owner Sylvia Beach, after no mainstream publisher would touch it, Ulysses follows an ordinary Dublin man named Leopold Bloom through a single day, June 16, 1904, in a torrent of styles, voices, parodies, and innovations that scholars have been unpacking for over a century. It borrows its structure from Homer's Odyssey, but its true subject is the texture of a single human consciousness moving through a single day. The book was banned in the United States and Britain for more than a decade on grounds of obscenity, a ruling that seems absurd today, but was a real obstacle at the time. T.S. Eliot called it the most important expression which the present age has found. His final work, Finnegan's Wake, went further still, dissolving the English language into a dreamlike, multilingual, pun-riddled river of sound that divided critics then and continues to divide them now. When the Second World War came and Paris fell to the Germans, Joyce fled back to Zurich with Nora, arriving in December 1940. He was already in poor health. Barely a month later, in January 1941, he was hospitalized with a perforated duodenal ulcer. He underwent surgery but did not recover. He died on January 13, 1941, at the age of 58. Nora tried to have his body sent back to Ireland, but the Irish government, apparently still uncomfortable with the author of Ulysses, declined to help. So Joyce was buried here in Fluntern. In 1966, on Bloomsday, June 16th, the date celebrated by Joyce fans worldwide, his remains were moved to an honorary grave provided by the city of Zurich. Nora, who had died in 1951, and their son Giorgio were reinterred beside him. A bronze statue by the American sculptor Milton Hebald sits near the grave, depicting Joyce in a characteristic pose, legs crossed, book in hand, a look of thoughtful detachment. Nora reportedly observed about the cemetery's location that at least her husband was near the zoo. He had always been fond of animals. A few paces from Joyce at Fluntern, we find the grave of another literary titan, and this one did win the Nobel Prize. Elias Canetti rests here, by his own request, close to Joyce. Canetti was born in 1905 in Ruse, Bulgaria, into a Sephardic Jewish family whose first language was Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish tongue of the diaspora. He later mastered German, English, and French. His masterwork, Crowds and Power, published in 1960, is a vast and strange exploration of mass psychology. Why crowds form, how power is exercised, what drives human beings to follow and to fear. His only novel, Auto da Fe, published in 1935, is a darkly brilliant study of intellectual obsession and collapse. In 1981, Canetti was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. He spent his final years in Zurich and died there in August 1994, at the age of 89. He had specifically asked to be buried near Joyce, and the city honored that request. Two of the 20th century's most radical prose writers now lie side by side on a hillside in Zurich near the zoo. Before leaving Zurich, we make two more stops. First, the Seelfeld Cemetery, the largest green space in the city, where two very different figures await us. Johannes Spiri, the creator of Heidi, is buried here. Spiri was born in 1827 in the village of Herzl, near Zurich, and spent most of her life in the city. She did not begin writing until her 40s, but when she published Heidi's Years of Wandering and Learning in 1880, she created one of the most enduring characters in children's literature. The story of the orphan girl living with her grandfather in the Swiss Alps has been translated into more than 50 languages, adapted for film and television countless times. Shirley Temple starred in the first major Hollywood version in 1937, and a Japanese anime series in the 1970s made Heidi beloved across Asia. Spiri wrote dozens of other books, but none came close to the fame of Heidi. She died in 1901 at the age of 74. Also at Seelfeld, we find the grave of a man whose name you may not know, but whose legacy touches millions of lives every single day. Henry Dunant is buried here, the founder of the International Red Cross. In June 1859, the young Swiss businessman was traveling through northern Italy on a business matter when he stumbled upon the aftermath of the Battle of Solferino, one of the bloodiest engagements of the 19th century. Nearly 40,000 soldiers from the French, Sardinian, and Austrian armies lay dead or wounded on the battlefield. There was almost no organized medical care. Dunant was horrified. He spent days helping to organize local civilians, many of them women from nearby villages, to tend to the wounded, regardless of which army they belonged to. The experience changed the direction of his life entirely. He abandoned his business affairs and wrote a book about what he had witnessed, A Memory of Solferino, published in 1862. In it, he proposed two radical ideas. First, that every country should establish a permanent volunteer society trained to care for the wounded in wartime. And second, that nations should agree to a set of international rules protecting medical personnel and the wounded on the battlefield. Both ideas were realized with astonishing speed. In 1863, the International Committee of the Red Cross was founded in Geneva, and in 1864, the first Geneva Convention was signed by 12 nations. The Red Cross symbol, the inverse of the Swiss flag, became a universal emblem of humanitarian aid. In 1901, Dunant shared the very first Nobel Peace Prize with the French pacifist Frédéric Passy. But by then, Dunant was living in poverty and obscurity. He had lost his fortune through a series of disastrous business ventures in Algeria, and he had been marginalized by some of his own colleagues at the Red Cross organization he had helped to create. He spent his final 18 years in a small hospital in the village of Heiden in eastern Switzerland, largely forgotten by the outside world until a journalist rediscovered him. When he died in October 1910, at the age of 82, he had asked that there be no funeral ceremony and that his body be carried to the grave like a dog. His cremated remains were brought to Zurich. The organization he created now operates in virtually every country on Earth, and the Geneva Conventions he inspired remain the cornerstone of international humanitarian law. Not far from Seelfeld, at another Zurich cemetery, the Israelitischer Friedhof Unterer Friesenberg, a Jewish cemetery on the western slopes of the city, we come to one of the most heartbreaking stories on our entire tour, the grave of the tenor Joseph Schmidt. Schmidt was born in 1904 in a small village near Czernowitz, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today it is part of Ukraine. He grew up speaking German, Yiddish, Romanian, and Hebrew, and from early childhood his voice was something extraordinary, a sweet, lyric tenor with an effortless high register that could sail up to a high D. His first vocal training came in the Czernowitz synagogue, where he sang as a boy alto. He moved to Berlin to study, and he dreamed of an opera career. But nature had played a cruel trick. Joseph Schmidt stood less than 5 feet tall. When the conductor Leo Blech first heard him sing, he was deeply moved, but brutally honest. "Pity you aren't small," Blech said. "But I am small," Schmidt replied. "No," said Blech, "you aren't small. You're too small." The operatic stage was closed to him, but the new medium of radio was not. Schmidt became one of the most famous voices in European broadcasting, and in 1933 he starred in a German film called Ein Lied geht die Welt, A Song Goes Round the World, that made him a continent-wide sensation. He toured the United States, performed at Carnegie Hall in New York, and was adored by audiences everywhere. Then the Nazis took it all away. Jewish artists were banned from performing in Germany, and Schmidt spent years on the run across Europe, to Belgium, to France. When someone apparently stole his identity and his passage on a ship bound for America, Schmidt was left stranded. In October 1942, he crossed the Swiss border illegally. Although he held an American visa and was an internationally known artist, the Swiss authorities interned him in a refugee camp near Zurich. His health, already fragile, deteriorated rapidly. He was hospitalized for a throat infection and complained of severe chest pains, but his complaints were dismissed and he was discharged. 2 days later, at a nearby inn where he was trying to rest, Joseph Schmidt suffered a heart attack and died. He was 38 years old. He was to have been issued a work permit the very next day. It was reported that all 350 inmates of the camp attended his funeral in defiance of authorities. In 2008, an astronomer named a small star after him. His grave here bears the words "Einstern fällt," a star fell. From Zurich, we head south to the lakeside town of Kilchberg, just a few minutes away. The municipal cemetery here has a view of Lake Zurich, and it contains the grave of one of the towering figures of German literature, Thomas Mann. Mann won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1929, primarily for his first great novel, Buddenbrooks, published when he was just 25. A sprawling, richly detailed chronicle of a merchant family's rise and decline across 4 generations in the North German city of Lübeck. The novel drew heavily on Mann's own family history and established him as one of the foremost literary voices of the German-speaking world. He followed it with The Magic Mountain, set in a Swiss tuberculosis sanatorium perched high in the Alps at Davos. Yes, the same Davos where we will later visit the painter Kirchner. The novel captures an entire civilization on the brink of catastrophe, using the enclosed world of the sanatorium as a metaphor for a Europe sleepwalking toward the First World War. Its characters debate philosophy, politics, love, and death over cups of hot chocolate while the snow falls outside. His novella, Death in Venice, published in 1912, explored obsession, artistic decay, and the conflict between Apollonian restraint and Dionysian passion with devastating precision, and was later adapted into a celebrated film by Luchino Visconti. Mann fled Germany almost immediately when the Nazis rose to power in 1933. He lived first in Switzerland, then in the south of France, then in Princeton, New Jersey, and finally in Pacific Palisades, California, where he became part of a remarkable German émigré community that included fellow exiles Bertolt Brecht, Arnold Schoenberg, and Theodor Adorno. He became an American citizen and was a prominent public voice against fascism, delivering radio broadcasts beamed into Germany, urging his former countrymen to resist Hitler. After the war, disillusioned by McCarthyism and the rising anti-communist climate in America, he moved back to Europe and settled in Kilchberg in 1954, overlooking Lake Zurich. He died here in August 1955 at the age of 80, barely a year after his arrival. His wife Katia, a formidable woman who managed every aspect of his life and career, survived him by a quarter century and is buried beside him. Our tour now swings southwest toward Lake Geneva and the tiny village of Céligny, tucked between Geneva and Lausanne. The Vieux Cimetière, the old cemetery, is as intimate a burial ground as you will find anywhere, overgrown in the most beautiful way with a stream running through a small ravine along its edge. And here rests one of the great Shakespearean actors, Richard Burton. Born Richard Walter Jenkins Jr. in 1925 in Pontrhydyfen, a mining village in South Wales, Burton was the 12th of 13 children. His father was a coal miner and a heavy drinker. His mother died when he was 2. The family was so large and so poor that young Richard was raised by an older sister. His life changed forever when a schoolteacher named Philip Burton recognized the boy's extraordinary talent, his voice, his memory, his fierce intelligence, and became his guardian. Philip Burton essentially adopted him and gave him his surname. It was one of the most consequential acts of mentorship in the history of the performing arts. Burton's voice, deep, resonant, unmistakably Welsh, capable of making Shakespeare sound like it was written in music, was his supreme instrument. He was electrifying on stage. John Gielgud, who directed him in Hamlet on Broadway in 1964, said he had never seen a young actor with such raw power. On film, he was nominated for 7 Academy Awards for My Cousin Rachel, The Robe, Beckett, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Anne of the Thousand Days, and Equus. He never won, one of the most conspicuous omissions in Oscar history, and one that seemed to genuinely wound him. But what made Burton a global tabloid fixture was his love affair with Elizabeth Taylor, which began on the set of Cleopatra in 1962. Both were married to other people at the time. The affair became the most covered celebrity romance in the world. They married in 1964, divorced in 1974, married each other again in 1975, and divorced again in 1976. Taylor later said that Burton was the love of her life. He reportedly felt the same. Burton was also a serious drinker, prodigiously, self-destructively so, and his alcoholism took a terrible toll on his health and his career. By his 50s, the roles were smaller, the films were weaker, and the drinking was worse. He bought a house in Céligny in the late 1950s and named it Le Pays de Galles, Wales. He returned to it throughout his life, drawn by the quiet and the proximity to the lake. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage in Geneva in August 1984 at the age of 58. He had married his 4th wife, Sally Hay, just the year before. Elizabeth Taylor did not attend the funeral, but she came to the cemetery a few nights later, alone in the dark, to say goodbye privately. A Scottish photographer who had staked out the cemetery, guessing she might come, asked her respectfully if he could take a photograph. She told him to give her a little time alone with Richard first, and then he could shoot. His photographs appeared around the world. The grave fell into disrepair over the years but was lovingly restored in 2022 by a Welsh fan living in Switzerland. Burton may have left Wales as a young man, but Wales never left him, and his admirers have made sure this corner of Switzerland remains a little piece of it. And here is a remarkable coincidence. Or perhaps not. Just a few steps from Burton in this very same small cemetery lies another famous figure, the Scottish novelist Alistair MacLean. If you grew up reading thrillers, you know MacLean's work. The Guns of Navarone, a team of Allied commandos sent to destroy a pair of massive German guns on a Greek island. Where Eagles Dare, a squad of agents infiltrating an impregnable Nazi fortress in the Bavarian Alps. Ice Station Zebra, a submarine racing to the Arctic to recover a downed spy satellite. These were books that grabbed you by the throat on page 1 and did not let go until the end, and they sold over 150 million copies worldwide. Several became blockbuster films. Gregory Peck and Anthony Quinn in The Guns of Navarone, Clint Eastwood and Richard Burton in Where Eagles Dare. MacLean served in the Royal Navy during the Second World War, and the harrowing experience of convoy duty in the Arctic aboard HMS Royalist, freezing seas, U-boat attacks, the constant fear of death, became the basis for his first novel, HMS Ulysses, published in 1955. It became an immediate bestseller. he was never pretentious about his talent. "I'm not a born writer," he once said, "and I don't enjoy writing. I wrote each book in 35 days flat, just to get the darn thing finished." He made so much money that he moved to Switzerland as a tax exile, settling along Lake Geneva. His later years were plagued by alcoholism, a problem that damaged both his health and his later novels, which never quite matched the power of his early work. He died of heart failure in Munich in February 1987, at the age of 64. No one, including the British Embassy, seemed to know what he was doing in Munich at the time. He was brought back to Séligny and buried here, just yards from Richard Burton, the star of the film version of Where Eagles Dare. The two had reportedly come to blows during the production, a confrontation fueled by alcohol on both sides. Yet here they rest in death, neighbors in a cemetery so small and so overgrown that you could walk past it without knowing it was there. Now we travel along the lake to the resort town of Montreux, where the famed jazz festival draws music lovers every summer. In the nearby Clarens Cemetery, the Cimetière de Clarens, we find the grave of one of the 20th century's supreme novelists, Vladimir Nabokov. Nabokov was born in 1899 into an aristocratic family in St. Petersburg, Russia, a family wealthy enough that young Vladimir grew up trilingual in Russian, English, and French. His father was a prominent liberal politician who was assassinated by right-wing extremists in Berlin in 1922. The Russian Revolution had already swept away the family's fortune, and Nabokov spent the 1920s and 1930s as an émigré in Berlin, writing 9 novels in Russian under the pen name V. Sirin. These early novels, including The Defense, about a chess prodigy losing his grip on reality, and Invitation to a Beheading, a Kafkaesque fable of imprisonment, established him as the most gifted Russian prose writer of his generation. Then, fleeing the Nazis with his wife Vera, who was Jewish, and their son Dmitry, Nabokov emigrated to the United States in 1940 and reinvented himself entirely as an American writer. He taught Russian and European literature at Wellesley College and then at Cornell University, where students remembered him as a brilliant, eccentric lecturer who insisted they learn the physical details of the fiction they were reading. The layout of the streets in Dickens, the pattern of the wallpaper in Flaubert. He was also a serious lepidopterist who spent his summers hunting butterflies in the American West, and he discovered and named several new species and subspecies. His scientific classifications have been confirmed by modern DNA analysis. In 1955, after being rejected by 4 American publishers, he placed his novel Lolita with the Olympia Press in Paris. The book, narrated by the predatory, eloquent, self-deceiving Humbert Humbert, was controversial from the day it appeared and remains so. But it is now universally acknowledged as one of the masterworks of 20th century literature, a novel of dazzling linguistic invention and devastating moral complexity. It made Nabokov wealthy. In 1961, riding the financial success of Lolita and its film adaptation by Stanley Kubrick, he moved to the Montreux Palace Hotel, where he and Vera occupied rooms on the 6th floor with a panoramic view of the lake and the mountains. He composed his later novels here, Pale Fire, a wildly inventive metafictional puzzle about a poem and its deranged commentator, and Ada, an enormous, playful, and deliberately difficult family saga. He continued his butterfly research in the surrounding Alps and Pyrenees. He gave interviews on index cards, preferring to write out his answers in advance. He died of bronchitis in July 1977, at the age of 78, and was cremated. His remains were buried here at the Clarens Cemetery alongside Vera, who died in 1991, and their son Dmitry, who joined them in 2012. At the time of his death, Nabokov was working on a novel called The Original of Laura. He asked that the manuscript be burned. His family, after decades of deliberation, chose to publish it instead. Staying at the Clarens Cemetery, we find another grave that connects us to the world of music and performance, though of a very different kind from rock and roll. Dame Joan Sutherland, the Australian soprano the world called La Stupenda, is buried here. Sutherland was born in Sydney in 1926 and initially trained as a dramatic soprano, taking on the heavy Wagnerian roles that were in fashion at the time. Her husband, the conductor Richard Burton, was convinced she was on the wrong path. He recognized that her astonishing instrument, a voice of immense size and power combined with pinpoint agility, was ideally suited not to Wagner, but to the bel canto repertoire, the ornate, fiendishly difficult Italian operas of Donizetti, Bellini, and Handel that had fallen out of favor. His instinct proved transformative. Sutherland's February 1959 performance as Lucia di Lammermoor at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden was the sensation of the operatic season and instantly made her a worldwide star. The audience erupted. Critics reached for superlatives they had been saving for years. She could trill with perfection, execute staccatos like gunshots, and soar into the highest registers of the soprano voice with an ease that seemed to defy physics. The Italians, notoriously hard to impress when it comes to singing, bestowed on her the ultimate compliment. They called her La Stupenda. She performed at the Metropolitan Opera in New York for 26 consecutive seasons and is regarded as one of the greatest sopranos in the history of recorded sound. She won a Grammy Award in 1962, the first Australian ever to do so. In the 1960s, she and Bonange bought a chalet in Les Avants, a village above Montreux that was also home to Noel Coward, who became a friend and neighbor. Coward, in fact, helped the Sutherlands find the property. He pointed them to the house next door to his own. Sutherland retired from the stage in 1990 with a farewell performance on New Year's Eve at Covent Garden. She lived quietly in Les Avants for 2 more decades, gardening and doing needlework. She died at home in October 2010, at 83, from heart failure. She is buried here at the Clarens Cemetery in Montreux. Also at Clarens, we pause at the grave of the Austrian-born painter and poet Oskar Kokoschka, one of the most important figures of the Expressionist movement. Kokoschka's wild, psychologically penetrating portraits scandalized the Viennese art world in the early 1900s. His painting, The Bride of the Wind, depicting himself with his lover, the composer Alma Mahler, is one of the iconic images of early 20th century art. When the Nazis declared his work degenerate, Kokoschka fled, first to Prague, then to London. After the war, he settled in Villeneuve near Montreux and continued painting and teaching for decades. He died in February 1980 at the age of 93 and is buried here at Clarens alongside his wife Olda. And one more name from Clarens before we move on. Sidney Chaplin, the eldest son of Charlie Chaplin, also rests in this cemetery. Sidney Earl Chaplin was born in 1926 in Beverly Hills, the son of Chaplin and his second wife, Leda Gray. He grew up in the enormous shadow of his father's fame, but carved out his own career, particularly on Broadway, where he originated the role of Nicky Arnstein in the original 1964 production of Funny Girl, alongside a young Barbra Streisand. He also appeared alongside his father in the film Limelight. In later years, Sidney settled in Switzerland, near his father. He died in 2009 at 82. From Montreux, we travel west to the elegant city of Geneva. The Cimetière des Rois, the Cemetery of Kings, is Geneva's most prestigious burial ground, despite the fact that no kings lie here. The name comes from the nearby Rue des Rois. Burial here is restricted to magistrates and distinguished personalities who contributed to the city's reputation, and the grounds feel more like a sculpture garden than a traditional cemetery. Our first stop is at the grave of one of the most celebrated writers in the Spanish language, Jorge Luis Borges. Borges was born in Buenos Aires in 1899 and spent most of his life in Argentina. He was, in a sense, the writer's writer, the man other writers read when they wanted to be reminded of what literature could accomplish in the space of a few pages. His stories are marvels of compressed imagination, labyrinths inside labyrinths, a library containing every possible book ever written and every possible book that could be written, a garden of forking paths where time itself branches into infinite parallel realities. He wrote about infinity, about mirrors, about memory, about the nature of fiction itself, and he did it all in a prose style that was crystalline, exact, and hauntingly beautiful. His influence on world literature is incalculable. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Umberto Eco, Thomas Pynchon, Italo Calvino, Salman Rushdie, all acknowledged their debt to him. The magic realism that would define Latin American literature for a generation grew largely from seeds Borges planted. He began losing his sight in middle age due to a hereditary condition, and by his 50s he was almost completely blind, a bitter irony for a man who had spent his life surrounded by books. He had been appointed director of the Argentine National Library in 1955, and he later wrote a poem noting that God had simultaneously given him 800,000 books and darkness, a splendid irony worthy of one of his own stories. Despite his blindness, he continued to write, to lecture, and to travel until the end of his life, composing in his head and dictating to assistants. In 1986, knowing he was dying of liver cancer, he traveled to Geneva, a city he had loved since his teenage years, when his family had lived there and he had attended school. He arrived with his new wife, Maria Kodama, and died in Geneva in June 1986 at the age of 86. His burial in the Cemetery of Kings was a mark of deep respect from the city that had shaped him as a young man. Visitors sometimes rearranged the small stones on his grave in patterns that Borges himself might have appreciated. While we are at the Cemetery of Kings, we should pay respects to the most historically significant figure buried in these grounds, even though his exact resting place remains deliberately uncertain. John Calvin, the great Protestant reformer, is interred somewhere here. Calvin arrived in Geneva in 1536 and transformed the city into the epicenter of Reformed Protestantism. His theology, with its emphasis on predestination and the sovereignty of God, shaped the course of Christianity and influenced Western ideas about democracy, education, and work ethic for centuries. Calvin feared that his grave would become a site of veneration or desecration, so its precise location was kept secret. A modest marker was placed in the cemetery in 1999, but whether Calvin lies beneath it is anyone's guess. For a man who distrusted idolatry in all its forms, the mystery seems fitting. Also at the Cemetery of Kings rests one of the most influential thinkers in the field of child development, the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. If you have ever taken a course in psychology or education, you have encountered Piaget. His theory of cognitive development, the 4 stages from sensoromotor to formal operational, became the foundation of developmental psychology and transformed how the world educates children. He was born in Neuchâtel in 1896 and published his first scientific paper at the age of 11, an observation of an albino sparrow he had spotted in a park. He spent most of his career at the University of Geneva, where he established the International Center for Genetic Epistemology. Piaget died in September 1980 at 84 and was buried here among Geneva's most distinguished citizens. The Cemetery of Kings holds another scientific giant, and this one takes us back nearly 2 centuries. Sir Humphrey Davy, the British chemist who changed the world in ways most people encounter every day without knowing it, is buried here. Davy was born in Penzance, Cornwall in 1778, a world away from Geneva and a world away from the Switzerland of chocolate and ski resorts. He was a brilliant, restless young man who taught himself chemistry from a French textbook and by the age of 20 was experimenting with gases at a medical clinic in Bristol, where he discovered the intoxicating effects of nitrous oxide, laughing gas, and recognized its potential as an anesthetic, though decades would pass before the medical profession caught up with him. In 1801, he was appointed to the Royal Institution in London, where his spectacular lectures made chemistry fashionable among the British upper classes. Using powerful batteries, Davy isolated potassium and sodium for the first time in 1807, and the following year he isolated calcium, strontium, barium, and magnesium. He proved that chlorine was an element, not a compound. His most famous practical invention was the Davy lamp, a safety lamp for coal miners that used a fine wire gauze to prevent the flame from igniting explosive gases, a device that saved countless lives in British mines. Perhaps his greatest discovery, though, was a person, his young laboratory assistant, Michael Faraday. who would go on to surpass his mentor and become one of the most important scientists in history. Davy was later said to have called Faraday his greatest discovery. In his final years, weakened by decades of chemical exposure, Davy traveled Europe in search of better health. He died of heart failure in Geneva in May 1829 at the age of 50. His burial here in the Plain Palais Cemetery, far from his Cornish home, might seem surprising. But Davy had requested to be buried wherever he died, and Geneva was where his journey ended. Before leaving the Cemetery of Kings, we visit one more grave, this one belonging to a woman whose work changed the lives of millions of children, though her name is far less famous than it deserves to be. Eglantine Jebb is buried here. Jebb was an English social reformer born in Shropshire in 1876 into a prosperous philanthropic family. She was educated at Oxford, one of the first generation of women to study there, and worked as a teacher before finding her calling in humanitarian advocacy. In the aftermath of the First World War, as she learned about the devastating conditions facing children across Central Europe, starvation, disease, displacement, she founded Save the Children in 1919. The organization began with a public meeting in London's Royal Albert Hall and quickly grew into one of the most effective international aid organizations in history. But Jebb's most lasting contribution went beyond charity. She drafted the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, a visionary document that asserted for the first time that children have rights, the right to food, shelter, education, and protection that transcend national borders. The League of Nations adopted the declaration in 1924, and it later formed the basis of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989, the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history. Jebb herself was not a sentimentalist. She was practical, driven, and sometimes ruthlessly efficient in her advocacy. She once said, "Every war is a war against the child." She spent much of her later life in Geneva, close to the headquarters of the League of Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross, our earlier stop Henry Dunant's creation. Jebb's health had been fragile for years, worn down by thyroid disease and the relentless pace of her work. She died in Geneva in December 1928, at the age of just 52. The organization she founded continues to operate in over 120 countries, reaching tens of millions of children every year. From Geneva, we travel to the canton of Basel-Landschaft and the quiet town of Beersfelden, just outside the city of Basel. In the Jewish section of the local cemetery rests a man whose name is forever linked to one of the most important documents of the 20th century. This is the grave of Otto Frank, the father of Anne Frank. Otto was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1889 into a well-to-do banking family that had lived in the city for generations. He served as a lieutenant in the German army during the First World War. After the war, he went into business. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Otto moved his wife Edith and their two daughters, Margot and Anne, to Amsterdam, hoping to keep them safe. He established a small business selling pectin and spices. For a few years, the family lived a relatively normal life. Then Germany invaded the Netherlands in 1940, and the Franks were trapped. As restrictions on Jewish life tightened, Otto prepared a hiding place in the upper floors of his business premises at 263 Prinsengracht, the building that would become known as the Secret Annex. In July 1942, the Frank family and 4 others went into hiding. They lived there for 25 months, helped by a small group of Dutch employees including Miep Gies, Jan Gies, Bep Voskuyl, and Victor Kugler. During those months, 13-year-old Anne Frank kept a diary. On August 4, 1944, the annex was raided by German and Dutch police. The inhabitants were arrested and deported. Otto's wife Edith died of starvation at Auschwitz. Margot and Anne were transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where both died of typhus in February or March 1945, just weeks before the camp was liberated. Only Otto survived. He returned to Amsterdam gaunt and broken, and Miep Gies gave him his daughter's diary, which she had found on the floor of the annex after the arrest and kept hidden, hoping to return it to Anne herself. Otto read it and was overwhelmed, not only by the grief of what had happened, but by the quality of what his daughter had written. She had been revising the diary with the intention of publishing it after the war. Otto edited the manuscript and arranged for its publication in 1947 under the Dutch title Het Achterhuis, The Secret Annex. The English-language edition appeared in 1952 as The Diary of a Young Girl. It has since been translated into more than 70 languages and is one of the most widely read books in human history. In 1953, Otto married Elfriede Geiringer, herself an Auschwitz survivor whose husband and son had perished in the camp. The couple settled here in Beersfelden, outside Basel, where they lived quietly for nearly 3 decades. Otto spent the rest of his life managing his daughter's legacy, overseeing the Anne Frank House Museum in Amsterdam, and personally answering the thousands of letters that poured in from young readers around the world. He died in August 1980 at the age of 91. From Basel, we head south into Italian-speaking Switzerland, to the canton of Ticino and the village of Tegna near Locarno. In the modest local cemetery rests one of the most original crime writers America ever produced, Patricia Highsmith. Highsmith was born in Fort Worth, Texas in 1921, 9 days after her parents divorced, and raised in New York. Her relationship with her mother was toxic from the start. Her mother later told her she had tried to abort the pregnancy by drinking turpentine. That psychological wound runs through Highsmith's fiction like a dark vein. Her first novel, Strangers on a Train, published in 1950, caught the attention of Alfred Hitchcock, who turned it into a classic film the following year. The premise, 2 strangers agree to commit each other's murders, was pure Highsmith, psychologically twisted, morally slippery, and impossible to put down. But she is best remembered for creating Tom Ripley, the charming, amoral, endlessly adaptable protagonist of 5 novels beginning with The Talented Mr. Ripley in 1955. Ripley was unlike any character crime fiction had ever produced. He was a murderer without remorse, a social chameleon who could become anyone he needed to be, and yet the reader was somehow drawn into sympathy with him. Anthony Minghella's 1999 film adaptation, starring Matt Damon, captured the character brilliantly. Highsmith was always more admired in Europe than in the United States. The French adored her. She won the Grand Prix de Littérature Policière in 1957, and Graham Greene, whom we visited earlier on this tour, called her the poet of apprehension. Her second novel, The Price of Salt, published under a pseudonym in 1952, was groundbreaking for its time. A love story between 2 women that ended not in tragedy, but in tentative hope. It was adapted into the film Carol in 2015, starring Cate Blanchett. Highsmith moved to France in the late 1960s and then to Switzerland in 1982, settling in Tegna, in the Italian-speaking canton of Ticino. She lived there with her famous snails. She kept hundreds of them, carried them in her handbag, and was once reportedly spotted smuggling a purse full of them through customs. By most accounts, she was a difficult person, brilliant, contrarian, deeply private, and capable of startling rudeness. She died of aplastic anemia and lung cancer in February 1995, at 74. Her funeral was attended by barely a dozen mourners in a cold crematorium in nearby Bellinzona. It was probably exactly the send-off she would have chosen. Staying in Ticino, we travel to the hill town of Gentilino, part of the municipality of Collina d'Oro, near Lugano. The cemetery of Sant'Abbondio sits next to an 11th century church on a golden hillside overlooking Lake Lugano. Here lies one of the most widely read German-language authors of the 20th century, Hermann Hesse. If you discovered Siddhartha in your 20s, or Steppenwolf, or The Glass Bead Game, you never forgot the experience. Hesse's novels have a way of finding people at exactly the moment when they need them most, usually during some period of questioning or searching, when the gap between what the world expects of you and what your inner self demands becomes impossible to ignore. Born in the German town of Kalov in the Black Forest in 1877, Hesse grew up in a family of Protestant missionaries. He was expected to follow the same path, but he rebelled fiercely, running away from his seminary, suffering from depression, and eventually breaking with his family's expectations to pursue art and literature. His novels explore the tension between the spiritual and the sensual, the pull of conformity against the call of individual truth. Demian, published in 1919, was initially released under a pseudonym because Hesse wanted it to be judged on its own merits. It became a sensation among young German readers struggling with the aftermath of the First World War. Siddhartha, published in 1922, retold the Buddha's journey of enlightenment in Hesse's own lyrical prose. Steppenwolf, published in 1927, dove into the fractured psyche of a middle-aged intellectual, torn between his civilized persona and his wild, instinctual nature. And The Glass Bead Game, his final and most ambitious novel, imagined a future civilization devoted to the pure life of the mind, and asked whether such a civilization was worth having. Hesse had moved to Switzerland in 1912, first to Bern and then, in 1919, to Montagnola in the Italian-speaking canton of Ticino. He fell in love with the landscape, the terraced vineyards, the cypress trees, the views of Lake Lugano, and he spent the remaining 43 years of his life here. He painted watercolors prolifically, producing thousands of small landscapes and garden scenes that have become beloved in their own right. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1946, the same year he published The Glass Bead Game. Interestingly, Hesse's worldwide fame peaked not during his lifetime, but after it, in the mid-1960s, when American and European counterculture youth embraced Siddhartha and Steppenwolf as spiritual handbooks. Timothy Leary called him the poet of the interior journey. Hesse died peacefully in his sleep on August 9, 1962, at the age of 85 from a cerebral hemorrhage. His grave here at Sant'Abbondio is modest, just his name and the dates. His third wife, Ninon, rests beside him. The cemetery overlooks the lake, and if you visit on a clear day, you will understand why Hesse never wanted to leave. While we are at Sant'Abbondio, we should note that another great artist is buried in this same small cemetery, the German-born conductor Bruno Walter. Walter was one of the supreme conductors of the 20th century, renowned for his interpretations of Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, and especially Gustav Mahler, with whom he had a close personal and professional relationship. Walter gave the posthumous premieres of Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde and his Ninth Symphony. Born in Berlin in 1876, Walter fled Nazi Germany in 1933, eventually settling in the United States. After the war, he continued to conduct and record prolifically, producing landmark recordings with the Columbia Symphony Orchestra. He retired to Switzerland in his final years and died in Beverly Hills, California in February 1962 at the age of 85. But at his request, his remains were brought here to Gentilino to rest near his friend Hermann Hesse. From Ticino, we travel back west, deep into the Valais, to the village of Rhône, perched on a hill above the Rhône Valley. In the churchyard here, with a vast and silent alpine landscape stretching in every direction, rests one of the greatest poets the German language has ever produced, Rainer Maria Rilke. Rilke was born in Prague in 1875, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and spent his life moving restlessly through Europe, always seeking the solitude and beauty his poetry required. He lived in Germany, Russia, where he visited Tolstoy, France, where he served briefly as Rodin's secretary, Italy, Spain, and finally Switzerland. His early work was lyrical and romantic, but his mature poetry achieved something far more extraordinary, a language for experiences that had never quite been put into words before. The Duino Elegies, begun in 1912 at a castle on the Adriatic coast and completed 10 years later in a burst of inspiration at the Château de Mouzeau, near Sierre in the Valais, are among the greatest poems of the 20th century. They grapple with the terrifying beauty of existence, the gulf between human consciousness and the indifferent universe, and the possibility that death is not an ending, but a transformation. The Sonnets to Orpheus, written in the same astonishing creative explosion of February 1922, celebrate art, music, and the cycle of life and death. In just a few weeks, after years of creative silence, Rilke completed both masterworks, one of the most remarkable feats in literary history. He also wrote Letters to a Young Poet, a slim volume of correspondence with a would-be writer that has become one of the most beloved works of encouragement ever published, read by aspiring artists for over a century. Rilke chose Switzerland as his final home, drawn by the landscape of the Valais and by the patron who had provided him with the Château de Mouzeau. He died of leukemia in December 1926, at the age of 51. The traditional story holds that he pricked his finger on a rose thorn and the wound became infected, an account that scholars have questioned but that has proven impossible to dislodge from popular imagination. It is simply too poetic an ending for a poet. His grave in the churchyard at Rhône, high above the Rhône Valley, with mountains rising on every side, is one of the most spectacularly situated literary resting places anywhere in the world. On a clear day, the view from this churchyard will take your breath away. We now travel north to the canton of Bern. At the Schosshalden Cemetery, we find one of the most important visual artists of the 20th century, Paul Klee. Klee was born in 1879 in Münchenbuchsee, near Bern. Though technically a German citizen, his father was from Thurgau but had not obtained Swiss citizenship. Klee grew up in Switzerland and considered it his true homeland. As a young man, he was torn between music and art. He was an accomplished violinist, good enough to play professionally with the Bern Municipal Orchestra, but he chose painting. It proved to be one of the most consequential decisions in the history of modern art. Klee's work defied every attempt at categorization. He drew on Expressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, and Orientalism, mixing media and techniques with a freedom that no other artist of his era could match. His more than 9,000 works, paintings, watercolors, drawings, etchings, are populated by childlike figures, geometric puzzles, mysterious landscapes, floating fish, birds, and cryptic symbols that seem to rise from the deepest layers of the unconscious mind. His titles are often as playful and enigmatic as the images: Twittering Machine, The Goldfish, Senecio, Ad Parnassum. A trip to Tunisia in 1914 with the painter Auguste Macquer and the writer Louis Moilier awakened Klee's sense of color. He wrote in his diary, "Color has taken possession of me. I am a painter." He taught at the Bauhaus School alongside Wassily Kandinsky from 1921 to 1931, and his lectures on form, color theory, and visual composition were later published as the Notebooks of Paul Klee, which remain essential reading for art students. When the Nazis came to power and declared his art degenerate, they included 17 of his works in their infamous 1937 Munich exhibition designed to ridicule modern art. Klee returned to Bern. He was already suffering from scleroderma, a debilitating autoimmune disease that hardened his skin and gradually restricted his ability to hold a brush. In his final years, despite increasing physical limitation, he produced an astonishing body of late work. Bold, simplified, almost hieroglyphic compositions that many critics consider among his finest. He died in Meralto, near Locarno, in June 1940 at the age of 60. His Swiss citizenship application, filed years earlier, was approved 6 days after his death. Today, the Zentrum Paul Klee in Bern, a stunning undulating building designed by the architect Renzo Piano, houses the world's largest collection of his work, more than 4,000 pieces. Not far away, at the Bremgartenfriedhof in Bern, we find a very different kind of revolutionary, the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin. Bakunin was one of the founders of collectivist anarchism and a fierce, lifelong opponent of Karl Marx. The two clashed repeatedly and bitterly within the 19th century socialist movement over the question of whether revolution should lead to a centralized workers' state, as Marx argued, or to the immediate abolition of all state authority, as Bakunin demanded. History would prove that Bakunin's warnings about the dangers of revolutionary dictatorship were remarkably prescient. Born into a wealthy noble family in Russia in 1814, Bakunin abandoned his privileged upbringing for a life of revolutionary agitation that took him across the continent. He participated in the 1848 uprisings in Paris and Prague, helped lead the insurrection in Dresden in 1849, where he was captured, sentenced to death, and then had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment. He was handed over to the Russians, who locked him in the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg, and then exiled him to Siberia. In 1861, he pulled off one of the great escapes in revolutionary history, fleeing Siberia via Japan and the United States and making his way back to Europe to resume his agitation. His philosophical writings, particularly God and the State, remain foundational texts of anarchist thought, arguing that the state and organized religion are twin instruments of human oppression. Broken in health and spirit after decades of imprisonment, exile, and disappointed revolutionary hopes, Bakunin spent his final years in Bern and then in nearby Lugano, where he died in July 1876 at the age of 62. He was brought back to Bern for burial. His grave at the Bremgarten Friedhof is still visited by admirers and political pilgrims from around the world, and it is not unusual to find fresh flowers or small red and black anarchist flags left by visitors. From Bern, our route takes us eastward to the famous ski resort town of Davos, high in the Alps of Graubünden. In the Davos cemetery lies the German expressionist painter Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. Kirchner was a founding member of Die Brücke, the Bridge, the artistic group formed in Dresden in 1905 that helped launch German Expressionism. His bold, angular, vividly colored paintings of Berlin's street scenes, women in feathered hats striding through the electric night, trams and crowds, and the nervous energy of a modern city, are among the most recognizable works of the movement. He was drafted into the German army during the First World War, but suffered a severe physical and psychological breakdown. In 1917, he came to Davos to recover, drawn by the clear mountain air and the promise of isolation. The Swiss Alps became both his subject and his salvation. His alpine paintings vibrate with color and energy, bold blues, vivid greens, angular mountain forms rendered with a vitality that suggests Kirchner found in these landscapes a healing power he could not find anywhere else. He built a studio and settled into a productive routine, painting prolifically throughout the 1920s and 1930s. But when the Nazis came to power and declared his work degenerate, removing more than 600 of his paintings from German museums, and including several in the infamous Degenerate Art Exhibition of 1937, the blow was devastating. Kirchner had invested his identity in his art. To see it condemned and confiscated by a regime he despised broke something inside him. In June 1938, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner took his own life near his home outside Davos. He was 58. He is buried here, in the mountain town that was both his refuge and his final home. We now return to the Lake Geneva region, to the town of La Tour-de-Pays, near Vevey. The local cemetery here holds the remains of a writer who sold over 100 million books worldwide but remains almost unknown in America. A paradox that would have amused him enormously. James Hadley Chase is buried here. Chase was the pen name of René Lodge Brabazon Raymond, an Englishman born in London in 1906. He was the son of a colonial Indian Army officer, educated at King's School, Rochester. He never once set foot in the United States, yet he wrote over 90 crime and thriller novels set in America, soaking up the slang, the geography, and the atmosphere from dictionaries, maps, and pulp magazines. His method was as brazen as it was effective. He simply invented an America of the imagination, populated it with tough guys, dangerous women, and double-crossers, and wrote with such pace and conviction that millions of readers around the world never noticed or cared that it was all second-hand. His first and most notorious novel, No Orchids for Miss Blandish, published in 1939, was inspired by William Faulkner's Sanctuary and became a sensation and a scandal. George Orwell wrote a famous essay about it, attacking its casual attitude toward violence and its departure from the genteel English mystery tradition. But Orwell's disapproval did nothing to slow sales. Chase became a publishing phenomenon, particularly in France, where he was treated as a major literary figure, and across the developing world, where his cheap paperbacks were ubiquitous in airport bookstalls and hotel lobbies from Lagos to Mumbai to Buenos Aires. Among his most popular titles were The Flesh of the Orchid, I'll Bury My Dead, and the long-running series featuring the resourceful operative Mark Dodd. Chase moved to Switzerland in 1956, attracted by the low taxes and the discretion, and lived here in La Tour de Pays for the rest of his life. He died in 1985, at the age of 78, a millionaire many times over from a career built on a country he had never visited. From La Tour de Pays, a short trip takes us to the town of Bursens, in the hills above Rôle, on the northern shore of Lake Geneva. Here rests one of the most versatile entertainers of the 20th century, Sir Peter Ustinov. Ustinov was an actor, director, playwright, raconteur, and one of the great wits of the 20th century. He spoke at least 6 languages: English, French, German, Italian, Russian, and Spanish, and could impersonate practically anyone from any country on earth with devastating comic accuracy. He was a fixture on television talk shows where hosts would simply wind him up and let him go, and audiences roared as he shifted effortlessly between accents, characters, and anecdotes. He won 2 Academy Awards for Best Supporting Actor, for the cunning slave dealer Lentulus Batiatus in Spartacus in 1960, and the lovable con man Arthur Simon Simpson in Topkapi in 1964. He also won 3 Emmy Awards for his television work. Many remember him as Agatha Christie's fussy Belgian detective Hercule Poirot, whom he played in 6 films during the 1970s and 1980s, bringing a warmth and humor to the role that audiences adored. Born in London in 1921 to parents of Russian, German, French, and Ethiopian descent, Ustinov was a true citizen of the world from birth. He made his stage debut at 17 and sold his first screenplay at 24. During the Second World War, he served in the British Army, where his duties included serving as Batman, a personal assistant, to a young officer named David Niven. The two became lifelong friends, and both ended up living in Switzerland, not far apart. Ustinov settled in Bursens and served as Chancellor of the University of Durham. He was also a devoted UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador introduced to the charity by Audrey Hepburn, whom we visited earlier today at Talochenaz. He died at his Swiss home in March 2004, at the age of 82. And speaking of David Niven, our next stop is the alpine village of Château d'Eau, in the Pays d'en Haut region. Niven is buried here. Niven was the quintessential English gentleman of the screen. Suave, self-deprecating, armed with a perfect mustache and an air of effortless charm that concealed a life of genuine courage and considerable personal sorrow. Born in London in 1910, though he sometimes claimed to have been born in Kirriemuir, Scotland, just to be mischievous, Niven attended Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, and was commissioned into the Highland Light Infantry. He found army life in peacetime desperately boring and resigned his commission to try his luck in Hollywood, where he arrived with no contacts, no money, and no particular plan. Through sheer charm and persistence, he worked his way from extra to bit player to leading man. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Separate Tables in 1958, giving a deeply moving performance as a shy, lonely man hiding a secret. He starred in Around the World in 80 Days, The Guns of Navarone, where he appeared alongside our earlier friend Richard Burton's future neighbor, Alistair MacLean's most famous creation, and The Pink Panther, where his debonair jewel thief nearly stole the film from Peter Sellers. When the Second World War broke out, Niven was one of the first British actors in Hollywood to return home and enlist. He served with real distinction, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel and participating in the Normandy invasion. He rarely spoke about his war service and was characteristically modest about it, once saying he had spent the war being frightened. His personal life was marked by tragedy. His first wife, Primula Rollo, died in 1946 after falling down a flight of stairs during a party at Tyrone Power's house. Niven was devastated and never fully recovered from the loss. He was also a gifted writer. His memoir, The Moon's a Balloon, published in 1971, became one of the best-selling autobiographies of the 20th century, packed with hilarious and self-effacing stories about Hollywood, the war, and everything in between. Niven moved to Château d'Eau in 1960, drawn by the skiing, the quiet, and the company of nearby friends like Peter Ustinov and Noel Coward. His final years were shadowed by amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, which gradually destroyed his nervous system and robbed him of his famous, beautifully modulated speaking voice. It was a particularly cruel fate for a man whose voice had been one of his greatest assets. He died in July 1983 at 73. At his funeral in the tiny church at Chateau d'Oeil, the great violinist Yehudi Menuhin played, and Prince Rainier of Monaco was among the mourners. Niven was laid to rest in the cemetery beside the Church of St. Peter in the Alpine village he had made his home. Our tour takes us now to the western shore of Lake Geneva, near Lausanne, and the commune of Pully, where we find the grave of one of the most important authors in the French-speaking Swiss literary tradition, Charles Ferdinand Ramus. Ramus may not be well known to American readers, but in the Francophone world he is considered a major novelist, and in Switzerland he is a literary hero. His work captured the lives of ordinary people in the Swiss Alps, farmers, vineyard workers, villagers in the Vaud and Valais, with a poetic intensity and a fierce attention to landscape that have drawn comparisons to Thomas Hardy and William Faulkner. He wrote in a style that was simultaneously modern and deeply rooted in the rhythms of rural speech. His novels, including Aileen, The End of All Men, and Beauty on Earth, explore the collision between the ancient patterns of mountain life and the forces of modernity, nature, and fate. In 1918, he collaborated with Igor Stravinsky on The Soldier's Tale, a landmark piece of music theater for narrator, actors, and small ensemble. The two men were living near each other in the Vaud countryside during the First World War, and the piece, based on a Russian folktale about a soldier who trades his fiddle to the devil, was designed to be performed by a small touring company, cheap and portable enough to travel from village to village. It premiered in Lausanne and has since entered the standard repertoire. Ramus died in Pully in 1947 at the age of 69. His face appeared on the Swiss 200-franc banknote from 1997 to 2018, a fitting tribute to a writer who spent his life insisting that the small, the local, and the particular were as worthy of great literature as any palace or capital city. We have traveled now from Zurich to Geneva, from the Italian sunshine of Ticino to the alpine heights of Davos and the Valais. But our tour would not be complete without one more visit. And this final stop is for the woman whose voice could shake the earth, whose story is one of the greatest triumphs in the history of American music. We close our tour with Tina Turner. Born Anna Mae Bullock in Brownsville, Tennessee, in 1939, she grew up in the rural South, singing in church choirs and picking cotton alongside her family. Her parents separated when she was young, and she was raised partly by her grandmother in Nutbush, a tiny, unincorporated community where everybody knew everybody, and music was as natural as breathing. As a teenager in St. Louis, she went to a nightclub where Ike Turner's Kings of Rhythm were playing. When the band's booked singer failed to show for a recording session, the young Anna Mae stepped up to the microphone, and what came out stunned everyone in the room. A raw, powerful, electrifying voice that Ike Turner immediately recognized as a ticket to stardom. He renamed her Tina Turner, and the Ike and Tina Turner Revue became one of the most explosive live acts in the history of music. Their recording of Proud Mary, beginning as a slow, smoldering groove, Tina explaining to the audience that they never do anything nice and easy, then erupting into a full-throttle tempest of drums and vocals, is one of the great performances ever captured on tape. They charted hits like River Deep, Mountain High, produced by Phil Spector, and Nutbush City Limits, which Tina herself wrote. But behind the spectacle was a nightmare. Tina endured 16 years of horrific physical and psychological abuse at Ike's hands, beatings, burns, humiliation. She tried to end her own life at one point before finding the strength, through her Buddhist faith, to leave. She walked out of a hotel room in Dallas in 1976 with 36 cents in her pocket, a mobile gas card, and her stage name. She later said the name was all she wanted. What followed was one of the most extraordinary comebacks in popular music history. For years she played small clubs and casino lounges, surviving on grit and talent. Then came Let's Stay Together in 1983, a cover of the Al Green classic that put her back on the radio. And then came the album that changed everything. Private Dancer, released in 1984, which sold over 20 million copies worldwide. Its title track was a haunting song about a woman dancing for strangers, and What's Love Got to Do with It became the biggest hit of her career, reaching #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and winning 3 Grammy Awards, including Record of the Year. She was 45 years old, an age when most pop careers are long over. Tina Turner was just getting started on her second act. She sold out stadiums around the world, performed for audiences numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and became one of the highest-grossing touring artists of all time. She was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, first in 1991 as part of Ike and Tina Turner, and again as a solo artist in 2021. In the early 1990s, Tina moved to Europe to be with her partner Erwin Bach, a German music executive she had met at a Düsseldorf airport in 1986. They settled in Küsnacht, a wealthy town on the shores of Lake Zurich, and married in 2013 in a lavish ceremony attended by Oprah Winfrey and David Bowie. Tina gave up her American citizenship and became Swiss. She loved the quiet, the calm, the politeness, the way people simply left her alone. She once appeared in a Swiss telecommunications commercial, playfully poking fun at how her American friends couldn't understand her fondness for fondue and her peaceful Swiss life. Her final years were shadowed by serious health problems. A stroke in 2013, intestinal cancer in 2016, and kidney failure so severe that Erwin donated one of his own kidneys to save her life in 2017. She died at her lakeside home in Küsnacht on May 24, 2023, at the age of 83, after what her representatives described as a long illness. Fans gathered by the hundreds outside her estate, leaving candles, flowers, and handwritten notes along the gates of her waterfront property. The Swiss president paid tribute. The municipality of Küsnacht called her a proud citizen and noted how she had touched residents with her warmth and modesty. She was cremated, and a private funeral was held for close family and friends. Though there is no public grave for us to visit, her presence in this country, and her legacy everywhere, remains as powerful as ever. She was, as the song she made famous will always remind us, simply the best. And so our tour comes to an end. We have walked through cemeteries large and small, from Zurich's hillside at Fluntern to the quiet churchyard high above the Rhône in Rhône. We have visited the final resting places of actors and authors, painters and poets, scientists and humanitarians, racing drivers and fashion designers, revolutionaries and reformers, and the woman who invented the little black dress. 40 lives, 40 stories. They came from every corner of the globe, from Tennessee and Buenos Aires, from Prague and Pontrydefen, from Zanzibar and Fort Worth, and for reasons as varied as low taxes, broken hearts, alpine beauty, or simply the desire to be left alone, they ended up here, in Switzerland. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.